Hello to everyone on the line that is dialing in and joining us for this webinar. We will get going very shortly. We will just give it a little bit of time for people to join us on this session. In the meantime, if you could use the chat function on your control panel and let us know where you're dialing in from, that would be brilliant. It's always interesting for us to know where our attendees are joining us from. We tend to have a lot of attendees from Australian cities, but it'd be great to know if we do have people from the rural areas in Australia, as well as our kind of international audience, especially from Asia. So yes, please do let us know using that chat function where you're joining us from today. Auckland, wonderful, hello. Singapore as well, brilliant. We've got some international audience today, Martin, that's great. Trinidad and Tobago, wonderful, welcome. You pull in a truly international crowd. This is brilliant. Hong Kong as well, brilliant. Oh, yeah. Lovely. Well, hello to everyone on the line, and thank you so much for joining us. My name is Holly Baldwin from Informa, and I'm delighted to introduce you to this webinar on decarbonisation of the shipping industry. Just to let you know, the content will run for about 20 minutes or so, and then we will do a Q&A session. So please, 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 as we go along, keep your questions coming using either the chat or the Q&A tab on your control panel, and we'll get to as many questions as we can at the end of the session. But in the meantime, welcome to Professor Martin Davies. Over to you.
Well, good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you're calling in from. It's evening time where I am. I'm in New Orleans, Louisiana. But I lived for a long time in Australia, so it's good to be back sort of virtually in Australia. The topic for today's webinar is, as Holly's already said, decarbonisation of the shipping industry. And if people attending are on either the operational side of the industry or indeed the financing, ship financing side, you will already know quite how hot a topic this is. This is occupying the time of lots of people at the moment in the business. So if I go to my overview, which I hope everybody can see, it starts with a simple proposition that carbon emissions into the atmosphere are an increasingly urgent concern of our times. I mean, there's lots and lots and lots of stuff in the news about climate change, which, by the way, it has particular poignancy for me in New Orleans because we were hit by a hurricane 2 weeks ago that has caused quite a lot of damage to New Orleans. And this is not just an environmental topic, because it is very much a shipping industry topic now. But generally speaking, the emission of carbon into the atmosphere, it has been very difficult to achieve international cooperation. And this is because of something that philosophers call the tragedy of the commons, which is my little bullet point here. And the tragedy of the commons is that if anything requires sort of collective action among lots of people, or in this case, lots of countries, every one of those people or every one of those countries has the ability to kind of free ride on the efforts of others. And if everybody thinks, well, I'm not going to do it because everybody else is going to do it, then nobody does it. And that, starkly put, has been some of the problem with enforcement of the Paris Climate Agreement, which had these sort of very laudable goals, and actually enforcing the obligations that countries undertook in the Paris Climate Agreement has been much more difficult. Now, the shipping industry is in a completely different place at the moment. It is not in this everybody else is going to do something about it place. Now, the shipping industry is not actually responsible for a very large percentage of global emissions of CO2, that is, right? It's only about 3 or 4% by most measures. So it's not like a huge greenhouse gas creator, but it is taking more concrete internationally uniform steps than almost any other industry that I'm aware of. And the key words there are both concrete and internationally uniform. Right? These are legally enforceable measures that are going to apply in all countries, and they're going to come into force fairly soon. Now, these concrete internationally uniform steps are a result of regulations made by the International Maritime Organization, IMO, which is, as I'm guessing most people know, an agency of the United Nations. And the IMO's strategy is to reduce carbon intensity of international shipping by 40% by 2030. Now, the measure that they're reducing from is the amount of carbon emissions in 2008. That's the sort of baseline. And carbon intensity has to be reduced by 40% by 2030, which is actually not all that far away. That's 8 years away. And by 70% by 2050. Now, those are not just sort of aspirational goals. These are targets that have to be met. And the new regulations that I'm about to describe to you were adopted on the 17th of June this year. That's just 3 months ago. And they will affect all trading ships, with effect from 2023. So this is a really significant change to the way that shipping is going to have to be done, beginning in 2023, which is just 15 months away. And eventually, the implementation of these carbon reduction measures will cost trillions of dollars. I'll show you some of the estimates in a while. And by costing trillions of dollars, it will end up being quite a significant addition to the transaction costs of all international trade in goods, because of course, any expense that the operators have to incur gets passed on to their customers, and eventually it'll find its way into the price of all the goods that we buy that have been traded by sea, which is, well, certainly in the case of Australia, almost everything that is traded internationally comes by sea in Australia. So that's the overview of the position, that this is not just an aspirational goal. These are some concrete new regulations. Just to explain the measure that the new regulations use, there are two different measures, two different ways of measuring carbon emissions, both of which are used in the IMO strategy. And they are total emissions and carbon intensity, which I already mentioned. Now, I have to give credit for this little graph, which you may have seen before. Everybody seems to use this graphic, but it was produced by DNV, which is the Norwegian Classification Society. So I give them credit for their graphic. And what it shows, the blue lines, let's see if I can, like the blue lines here are what emissions will be if nothing is done. And obviously they're going to go up, right? Now the green lines are what the targets, the goals, indeed not just targets. And as I've already told you, that by 2030, the goal is to reduce intensity by 40%. Now, the important thing here is if you look at this line from 2020 to 2030, the line remains flat. And what that means is that total emissions will remain constant, even if intensity of emissions goes down by 40%, which is what the goal is. And the reason for that is that between 2020 and 2030, there will just have to be more ships on the water because the global population is increasing, international trade is increasing. And so even if intensity is reduced by 40%, the total amount of emissions will remain the same. But that's the goal by 2030, just 8 years away. And the goal by 2050 is a 50% reduction of total emissions. And for the reasons that I've just explained, to produce a 50% reduction in total emissions, there has to be a 70% reduction in the intensity of emissions. Now, after that point, the graph stops because the IMO strategy says, yeah, and if we get there, we'll try and get to zero as soon as we can after that. It becomes rather vague after that point, zero emissions as soon as possible within the century. But certainly, these are, as I'm about to show you, concrete targets that have to be met. Now, I apologize, I'm going to have to give you some jargon here because this area is already sort of full of jargon. But these are what the IMO calls performance-based regulations. And I'll explain what that means in just a moment. But since 2013, and that's 8 years already, all newly built ships, all new buildings, have been required to have, by regulation, something called an Energy Efficiency Design Index, EEDI. And what the EEDI is now I looked at this graphic and I realized just on going over it again that this is the wrong word. It's a maximum quantity of CO2 per ton mile, not a minimum quantity. And what that means is per ton mile means this is per the deadweight tonnage of a ship, so how much cargo it can carry rather than the weight of the ship itself. So how much deadweight tonnage per ton, per mile, there's a maximum quantity of carbon dioxide emissions. And that maximum number will gradually be decreased over time. So the regulations will become more and more stringent for the EEDI, that's for newly built ships. Now, these are what the IMO calls performance-based regulations. And that's effectively the IMO saying, we don't care how you get to this number, as long as you get to this number. Right? There are different ways of achieving the result. There are lots of different technologies that you might use. Go ahead and use them, but you have to reach this number. Now that has been in place, the EEDI requirement has been in place for 8 years already for all new ships built since 2013. Now the key thing that is focusing everybody's attention at the moment is that from 2023, all ships, and that's all ships, all trading ships, will have to have something called an Energy Efficiency Existing Ship Index, which you might think should be EEESI, but they have chosen to call EEXI just so that it sounds a bit like EEDI. And what this index will show is the carbon intensity emissions of a particular, of every ship, existing ships, not just newly built ships. And there will be a required reduction factor of CO2 emissions. And what this means is that for every ship sailing on the water, trading on the water from 2023, we'll have to document the intensity of its carbon emissions. And there will be its annual operational CII, carbon intensity indicator, will be documented, and then it will be rated according to the performance against that, that scale that it's required to meet. And it will be then given a grade, just like going back to school. It'll have a grade from A, B, C, D, E. And that will be examined, documented, and rated by the flag states. Now, I think everybody knows that many flag states, many countries with ship registries, are not actually always all that brilliant about enforcing regulations. So this may be done by classification societies acting on behalf of flag states. But what the regulations say is that poor ratings will have to be corrected. And again, this has a little bit of a feel of grade school in that 2 Ds in consecutive years will have to be corrected. 1 E will have to be corrected. And what that means is the ship will actually not be able to trade if it gets an E. or 2 Ds in a row. That's what the regulations say about what flag states will have to do. But very importantly, I think that port states may decide to have a completely different attitude to ships with poor ratings. And port states may actually decide to restrict entry to ships that have poor CII ratings in their EEXI. And again, I apologize for all the jargon, but you get the idea that if a ship remains a high carbon emitter, some ports may say, well, we now have this concrete evidence that you're a high carbon emitter and you're not coming. So that's the effect of these regulations that will come into force in 2023. Now, as I've said, these are performance-based regulations, so there are lots of different ways in which ship owners can comply with them. But the key point and why this is such a hot topic for those in operation and finance at the moment is that ship owners have to be preparing now. They're preparing now, even though the regulations are coming into force in 2023, because...
conference.
Oh, sorry. I can hear someone else speaking. And the reason why ship owners have to prepare now is ships last, the general rule of thumb for the working life of a trading ship is 15 years. But obviously some ships last longer than that. A lot of ships last longer than that. And if you count 15 years from now, that's 2036. That's well past the first target and well on the way to the 70% reduction that has to be in place by 2050. And so ship owners are forced now to be thinking about how they're going to comply in the future. There are various options, as I said. There's retrofitting of the existing ships, putting in new equipment. There's the possibility of making operational changes, and new buildings as the third option is simply recycling existing ships and building new ships with new technology. All of these options are on the table. Now, one key point here, and again, a little bit more jargon, I'm afraid, SOx, NOx, and PM is a reference to sulfur oxides, nitrogen oxides, and particulate matter. Now, there have been regulations in force for like many years now about the emission of these gases. And this is why ships now have to use low sulfur bunkers or scrubbers. The key point is that SOx, NOx, and PM are not greenhouse gases. So using low sulfur bunkers is not a solution to this problem. And the solution to this problem in the long run is using alternative fuel sources. And it is expected that the medium term, and when I say medium term, that's 15 years we're talking about, that within 15 years, the principal alternative fuel that will be used is liquefied natural gas, LNG. But that's only regarded as a medium-term solution because LNG is still a carbon emitter. And all the projections show that if ships sort of switch to LNG, as they are beginning to do, there are lots more LNG bunkering ports than there were just 2 years ago. But if ships switch to LNG, that's not going to achieve those targets in the IMO strategy. And so LNG is a medium-term solution, but the longer-term solutions are essentially other forms of fuel. Ammonia is a possibility, hydrogen is a possibility, biofuels is actually an interesting possibility. This is recycled oils from sugar or soybeans or cooking oil, and the particular interest in biofuels is that you can use biofuels with existing ships' engines. You don't have to retrofit the ship's engine in order to use biofuels. And there have been a couple of commercial voyages of vessels carrying sort of ordinary commercial cargoes already using biofuels. The problem with biofuels, though, is the production sources are far fewer. Wind, the use of wind energy in various ways. There are many projects. There are also operational ways of reducing carbon emissions. There are hull coatings that reduce the friction on the ship's hull as it goes through the water. Simply steaming more slowly reduces emissions as well. So, as I said before, because these are performance-based regulations, what owners and operators are now working out is, well, which combination of these things are we going to do in order to reach where we have to reach in relation to our carbon intensity of emissions, because that has to go down. It has to go down. And it will be expensive. The estimates now, and these are obviously only estimates. I have no idea how economists come up with these numbers, but the estimates are between 1.4 and 1.9 trillion dollars by 2050. And this is not just the changes that have to be made to ships. There will have to be new land-side infrastructure, such as bunkering facilities that can handle these alternative fuels, supply chains of the fuel from the production site on land to the bunkering facility, and so on. And I'm coming up to the end of my 20 minutes. So my last point is, what this is doing is clearly requiring ship owners and operators to think about new technologies that are going to cost a considerable amount of money. And then how is that going to be financed? There has been, in the last maybe 10 years, a shift away from what had previously been sort of traditional methods of ship financing towards things like ESG financing, ESG, environmental, social, and governance, which are as you probably know, funding with environmental goals, social goals, governance goals, explicitly as part of the funding. And ESG funding is obviously particularly interested in these projects of requiring funding. There's also a lot of talk about carbon taxes, not countrywide carbon taxes, but carbon taxes specific to shipping. Don't have time to go into detail about all of that. Essentially, it's not just the operational people who are thinking about ways of handling this, it is also the financing people, because the traditional methods of financing construction and operation and purchase of ships are just not going to work anymore. So that's a very speedy run through what I hope you can see is an enormous subject at the moment.
Martin, thank you so much for that. We did have questions coming in, so we will get to questions shortly. If you have more questions, please do pop them in the Q&A or the chat function, and we will address them shortly. Martin, if you could bring up the last slide.
Oh, sorry, yep.
As
Martin,
I
was in control, right? Yeah.
as Martin mentioned, this is a topic that he can talk on for hours and indeed days, and he does. So we do offer training programs with Martin on ship arrest, Incoterms, and tanker chartering, laytime, and demurrage. Don't worry too much about taking all the information down, as we will send out an email post-webinar. If you are interested in finding out more about these programs, we're delighted to offer anyone on the line today a 10% discount. And the best way to reach us is training@informa.com.au. These courses can also be run in-house. So if you have a team who you think would benefit from running it privately, again, let us know and we will answer any queries that you have. So on to questions. We've had a couple of great ones come in here, Martin. So I'll start with, there are a lot of EETs being marketed and claims on enhancing efficiency. However, there is hard data to validate the same and worth on an ROI basis.
Right. If I understand the question correctly, I mean, I guess the way that I would respond to that is that owners and operators are in something of a state of suspended animation at the moment, because nobody wants to be incurring a lot of expenditure on new technology that is going to turn out not to be the industry standard in 10 years' time, or is going to turn out to be more expensive in 10 years' time. And of course, the problem at the moment, as I think the questioner is addressing, is the hard data about these alternatives is very hard to come by, because they're all, I mean, there are lots of suggested alternatives, suggested methods of complying with these goals. But somebody has to move. Everybody has to move, actually, of course, from 2023. But exactly what will become the industry standard is not clear yet. And ship owners have some degree of trepidation, understandable trepidation, about choosing the wrong path. And there's nothing that can be done about that in 2021, because, as the questioner indicates, the only hard data we have are from various test programs that have been conducted.
Brilliant, thank you for that, Martin. The next one says, till when will LNG and LPG driven ships be relevant in terms of the decarbonisation timeline?
Hard to know, hard to know. The French container line CMA CGM took delivery just this year of an enormous container ship, one of the largest container ships in the world, CMA CGM Jacques Sardet. It's called 23,000 TEUs. That's entirely LNG powered. Now, that's on CMA CGM's part, that's a 15-year investment at least that they're expecting there. And again, you know, a fair question that doesn't have a clear answer. LNG seems to be what ship owners are expecting to replace traditional, you know, oil-based bunkers. And, you know, CMA CGM is investing in, not just it, but is investing a large amount of money in LNG powered ships. How long will that last? Again, it's just a guess, but the projections that I've seen, I said, projected to be about 15 years, because other fuels will have to be used if those regulations are enforced in the way that they're envisaged to be enforced.
Yeah, it's part of the process, that one. It's hard to put a definitive time on it.
Right, right.
This next one's a great question. It says, how does buying fuel that is carbon neutral, i.e. fuels that are offset by the carbon abatement in other methods, affect the IMO regulations for decarbonisation? Right.
This is a level of complexity that I didn't have time to cover, but the European Union is including shipping in its carbon trading scheme beginning in 2023 as well. Now, the IMO regulation is simply just sort of old-fashioned regulation in the sense of you have to do this, whereas the EU's method is a cap and trade system where people can trade carbon emission credits. And for any ship that is trading internationally and is going to the European Union, it's going to have to comply with both sets of regulations. And the IMO is a simple sort of old, well, I say old-fashioned, it's the traditional method of regulation. Government tells you you've got to do this. The European Union's method is a cap and trade method, which is much more consistent with what the questioner was asking about. So you can buy the credits to do this. So you might be able to comply with the EU system by buying carbon emission credits. but that's not going to help you with your CII index so far as the IMO regulation is concerned.
Wonderful, thank you. This next one is the last one we do have for the time being. So if anyone on the line does have a question, please do use this time while we answer this next one to pop them into either the Q&A or the chat button. It says, given that some companies are claiming LNG to be carbon neutral, how does one certify the same?
I'm not sure about the answer to that, because there are different types of LNG, as I understand it, and the move to carbon neutral LNG may indeed, coming back to the first answer as the first questioner's answer, the answer to the first question, heavens, is maybe this will extend the life of LNG as an alternative fuel source. The key question, though, which I think is what this questioner is asking, is how can we be sure of the carbon emission level of a particular grade of LNG fuel? That's a more technical answer that you need to ask an operations person rather than a lawyer such as myself. But I mean, you're clearly right that that's going to be an important question for operators to ask, because they are going to have to comply with the CII index. And if they're going to do that by buying a particular type of fuel, they're going to have to know how that fuel is operating. And as I think I've made clear in at least my response to the questions, everybody is presently operating in an atmosphere of some uncertainty, because everybody just knows what they have to do. Nobody quite knows how they're going to do it just yet.
Yeah, still a lot of moving parts. We have had a few more come in. The next one says, what are other greenhouse gases other than CO2 considered in EEXI?
As far as I think there are some of the NOx are actually greenhouse gases as well, but it's principally about carbon emissions. It's principally about carbon dioxide, because the EEXI measures the CII, which is the carbon intensity indicator. So that, I mean, if I understand the questioner's question correctly, carbon is not the only carbon compounds are not the only greenhouse gases. So, for example, ammonia, one of the great advantages of ammonia is that it's carbon neutral, but it can produce methane, which is actually a very powerful greenhouse gas. So that's one of the downsides of using ammonia, which is it has the potential to be carbon neutral, but still a greenhouse gas producer. But to come back to the short answer to the question, the EEXI is going to measure carbon emissions, carbon intensity. Okay.
The next one we have says, does the regulation require data on performance to be collected automatically to prevent manual data manipulations?
The short answer to this, I think, is no, right? If you, again, I think there's a tremendously complex technical answer to this, but I think that what is conceived of, certainly what the classification societies are conceived of, is that this be done automatically, and automatically by data download from the ship to shore-based recording systems. I think that's, you know, if you're thinking sort of 10, 15 years ahead, I think that what people like DNV are considering is not, you know, some second mate writing down numbers in a logbook, but that this be automatically measured and then automatically downloaded by sort of data transmission from the ship to shore-based systems. That's the kind of thing that the classification societies are thinking about, because of course classification societies traditionally would come in and sort of measure and look at the records and so on. they're now contemplating a kind of continuous stream of information coming from the ship.
Wonderful. Well, that is all the questions that we've had come through for this session. I want to say a huge thank you to everyone for joining us today and for being so interactive and getting involved. It's been great to have your questions and your insights on where you were joining us from. But the biggest thanks of the day goes to Professor Martin. Thank you so much for joining us today and this insight. It's been an absolute pleasure to host with you today.
Great, thank you very much. And thank
Wonderful.
you to everybody for some very focused questions.
Indeed.
Right.
Thank you very much. And wherever you are, have a good afternoon, morning or evening. Bye-bye.
Okay, bye-bye.